I realized my marriage was over the moment I heard another woman laughing in my kitchen. And it wasn't just the sound. It was the way he laughed with her. I stood outside my own front door, my hand frozen just inches from the handle, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the porch like something out of a life I no longer recognized, and for a second I actually questioned whether I had the right house, because nothing about that laughter felt like it belonged to me anymore. Not in the place where I used to cook dinner every night, not in the space I had spent years turning into a home, not in the life I thought I was still part of. And yet there it was again, her voice light, confident, comfortable, followed by his Daniel's, low and amused, a tone I hadn't heard directed at me in months, maybe longer, and my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain, not sharp enough to hurt, but heavy enough to make breathing feel like work, like something I had to remind myself to keep doing. And I stood there longer than I should have, listening, trying to make sense of something that deep down I already understood, because this wasn't sudden, it wasn't out of nowhere, it was the result of a slow, quiet unraveling that had been happening right in front of me while I convinced myself everything was still fine, still fixable, still worth holding on to, even when he stopped asking how my day was, even when he started leaving his dishes on the table without a word, even when "can you help me" turned into "why haven't you done this yet?" And somewhere along the way, I had gone from being his partner to something else. Entirely, something smaller, something easier to ignore, easier to command, easier to replace, and I didn't even notice the exact moment it happened. Only that one day I looked up and realized I was the only one still trying, still adjusting, still making excuses for a man who no longer saw me as his equal. And maybe that's why I didn't open the door right away, because a part of me was hoping that if I just stood there long enough, the sound would disappear, that the laughter would fade, that I could walk in and everything would go back to the way it used to be, but it didn't. It stayed steady and real, and when I finally pushed the door open, the smell of something unfamiliar hit me, first sweet and floral, not the kind of scent I ever wore, and then I saw them, right there in the living room like it was the most natural thing in the world, Daniel leaning casually against the couch, relaxed, at ease, and next to him a woman I had never seen before, sitting like she belonged there, like she had every right to be in my home. And for a moment no one said anything, the room just held its breath around us. And I realized then with a strange, quiet clarity that whatever this was, whatever my marriage had become, I was no longer part of it. I did not say anything right away, and neither did Daniel. He just looked at me like I had walked into a room I was not supposed to be in, like I was the one interrupting something important. And that was when I noticed the smallest details, the kind that hurt more than anything obvious, her shoes placed neatly by the couch like she had already made herself comfortable, a glass of wine in her hand, the one I usually kept for special occasions, and Daniel standing there without even the slightest hint of guilt, just calm, almost annoyed, as if he had been expecting this moment but did not care how it would affect me. And I felt something shift inside me, not an explosion, not anger, just a quiet awareness settling in, the kind that tells you everything you need to know without anyone saying a word. And finally he spoke, his voice casual, almost dismissive. "Emily, you are home early." Like that was the only thing worth acknowledging. Like the presence of another woman in our living room required no explanation at all, and I looked at him, really looked at him, trying to find something familiar in his face, some trace of the man I used to know, but all I saw was distance, a version of him that had slowly replaced everything we used to be. And I asked the only question that made sense in that moment, "Who is she?" And he did not hesitate, not even for a second. "This is Sophia," he said. Like he was introducing a coworker, like this was normal, like I should just accept it. And Sophia smiled at me, polite, almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse because it meant she knew exactly who I was, exactly what this situation looked like, and she was still sitting there like she belonged. And Daniel continued before I could respond, "She is going to stay here for a while, just a few days," he added, as if that made it better, as if adding a time limit somehow softened what he was doing. And I waited for more, for an explanation, for anything that showed he understood how wrong this was. But nothing came, just silence filling the space between us, thick and uncomfortable. And in that silence memories started to surface, small moments I had ignored, the late nights, the phone calls he took in another room, the way he stopped asking about my day, the way he started giving instructions instead of having conversations. And suddenly it all made sense, not in a dramatic way, not like a shocking revelation, but like a puzzle that had been sitting in front of me the whole time, slowly coming together piece by piece. And I realized that this moment was not the beginning of something breaking. It was the confirmation that it had already been broken for a long time. And the worst part was not that he had brought her into our home. It was that he did not even think he needed to hide it anymore. Like my presence no longer mattered enough to consider. Like I had already been replaced in every way that counted. And I stood there, completely still, feeling the weight of that realization settle over me. Not as pain but as clarity, the kind that does not leave room for denial, the kind that changes everything whether you are ready or not. Daniel did not wait for my reaction. He simply turned back toward Sophia like the conversation with me had already ended, like I had already accepted whatever arrangement he had decided without my input. And that was when something inside me finally clicked into place, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift that made everything feel strangely distant, like I was watching my own life from the outside. And I noticed how easily he moved through the space, how naturally he reached for the remote, how comfortably he sat down next to her on the couch that I had picked out years ago. And it felt unreal not because of what he was doing, but because of how normal he made it seem, like I was the only one who understood that something was deeply wrong. And I found myself asking another question, not because I expected a real answer, but because I needed to hear him say it out loud. "Daniel, what is this?" And he let out a small sigh, the kind people use when they are tired of explaining something obvious, and he looked at me with that same distant expression and said, "Do not make this more complicated than it needs to be. She just needs a place to stay." And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the simplicity of his words made the reality even clearer. And I said, "In our house," and he shrugged like it was not a big deal, like the word "our" had already lost its meaning to him. And that was when his tone changed slightly, not aggressive, not loud, just firm in a way that made it clear he had already made up his mind. "Emily, you are overreacting. You are here all day anyway. It is not like this changes anything." And those words settled into the room heavier than anything else he had said, because they revealed exactly how he saw me, not as his wife, not as his partner, but as someone who simply existed in the background of his life, someone whose presence was convenient but not important, someone who could be adjusted around without consideration. And I felt a brief flash of something sharp, not anger but recognition, the kind that comes when you finally see the truth you have been avoiding. And Sophia shifted slightly beside him, her expression careful, almost cautious now, like she could sense the tension even if she was not part of it. And I realized then that this moment was not just about betrayal, it was about erasure, about how easily I had been reduced to something less without even noticing it happening. And Daniel continued, as if explaining a simple arrangement: "You can just focus on your usual things, the house, the cooking. It is not like you have anything else going on." And that sentence, more than anything else, made everything perfectly clear, because it was not just dismissive, it was final. It defined my role in his life in a way that left no room for anything else. And for a second I just stood there, absorbing it, letting the weight of his words settle into something solid and undeniable. And then I nodded slowly, not in agreement, not in acceptance, but in understanding, because for the first time in a long time I was not confused, I was not questioning myself, I was not trying to fix something that was already broken. I was simply seeing things exactly as they were. And that clarity, quiet and steady, felt more powerful than anything I could have said in that moment. I did not argue, and that seemed to confuse him more than anything else, because Daniel was used to resistance, used to me trying to explain, trying to fix, trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through my fingers. But this time I simply turned away and walked into the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had spent countless mornings making coffee for him before he even asked. The same counter where I used to stand waiting for him to come home so we could eat dinner together. And now it felt like a place I was only visiting, like I no longer belonged to it in the way I once did. And I reached for a glass without thinking, filling it with water just to have something to do with my hands, something steady, something simple, because everything else around me felt unfamiliar in a way I could not ignore anymore. And behind me I could still hear them, their voices low, their conversation continuing like nothing had happened, like I had not just walked into the room and seen everything clearly for the first time. And I realized that this had probably been going on for a while, longer than I wanted to admit, not just the relationship but the shift in how he treated me, how he spoke to me, how he slowly removed me from his life piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. And I thought about the past year, the small moments that now seemed obvious, the times he criticized how I cleaned, how I cooked, how I organized the house, like everything I did was somehow not enough, not efficient enough, not valuable enough. And at the time I had told myself he was just stressed, just tired, just going through something. But now I understood that it was not stress, it was perspective. He had already decided what I was worth, and he treated me accordingly. And I leaned against the counter, staring at the sink, noticing how quiet everything felt inside me. No panic, no desperation, just a calm awareness that settled deeper with every second. And I realized that I had been shrinking myself for a long time, adjusting, compromising, lowering my expectations just to keep the peace, just to keep the idea of us alive, even when the reality no longer matched it. And I could still hear Daniel's voice in the other room, casual, comfortable, as if this was his normal life now. And maybe it was Maybe I was the only one who had not caught up yet, the only one still holding on to something that no longer existed, and I set the glass down slowly, my reflection faintly visible in the kitchen window. And for a moment I studied it, the tired eyes, the quiet expression, the version of myself that had accepted less for so long that it almost felt normal. And that was when a simple thought crossed my mind, clear and undeniable. This is not my life anymore, not in the way I thought it was, not in the way I wanted it to be. And for the first time that realization did not feel like loss, it felt like something else entirely. Something that had been waiting beneath the surface all along. Something that finally had space to exist now that everything else had fallen away. That night did not turn into a confrontation. It did not turn into raised voices or dramatic accusations. And somehow that made it feel even more final, because everything continued in a way that should have been normal but was not. And I moved through the house quietly, almost like a guest, noticing every small detail with a clarity I had never had before. The way Sophia's bag rested near the stairs, the way Daniel had left his jacket on the chair without a second thought, the way the television played softly in the background while they talked as if I were not there at all, and I realized that I had spent years building a life that could continue without me, a routine that did not actually require my presence, only my function, and that thought stayed with me as I walked upstairs, each step slow, deliberate, like I was measuring the distance between who I used to be and who I was becoming. And when I reached the bedroom, I paused at the doorway, taking in the familiar space that suddenly felt different, not because anything had changed physically, but because I could finally see it for what it was instead of what I wanted it to be. And I stepped inside, closing the door gently behind me, shutting out the quiet sounds of their voices downstairs. And for a moment I just stood there, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of the day sink in without trying to push it away. And then I walked to the closet and opened it slowly, my eyes scanning over rows of clothes, most of them chosen for practicality, for comfort, for a life that revolved around someone else's schedule, someone else's needs. And I reached for a suitcase, the one I had not used in years, the one that had once been part of plans and trips and ideas that never quite happened, and I placed it on the bed, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward in a way that felt steady and certain, and I began to pack. Not everything, just what mattered, just what felt like mine, and with each item I folded, each piece I placed inside, I felt something shift further, like I was reclaiming parts of myself that had been set aside for too long. And downstairs I could still hear laughter, faint now, distant, like it belonged to another life entirely. And I realized that I was not angry about it, not in the way I thought I would be, because anger required attachment, required expectation, and those things were already gone, replaced by something quieter, something more decisive. And when I finished, I closed the suitcase and sat on the edge of the bed, looking around the room one last time. Not searching for memories, not holding on to anything, just acknowledging what had been and what was no longer mine. And that was when I understood something clearly, something that changed everything without making a sound. I was not leaving because of what he had done tonight. I was leaving because of everything that had led to this moment, every word, every action, every time I had been made to feel smaller than I was. And as that thought settled, it did not feel like loss, it felt like direction, like the beginning of something I had not yet fully seen but already knew I needed. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to take that step without looking back. I did not leave that night the way most people would expect. There was no dramatic exit, no door slammed behind me, no final words thrown into the air to be remembered later. Instead I waited until everything went quiet, until the house settled into that late-night stillness where even the smallest sounds felt louder than they should. And I sat there in the dark for a while, my suitcase resting by the door, my thoughts steady in a way that surprised me, because for the first time I was not questioning myself, I was not wondering if I was making a mistake, I was simply ready. And sometime after midnight I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, uneven, followed by the soft click of a door closing, and I knew without looking that Daniel had gone into the guest room, not ours, not the bed we used to share, but somewhere else entirely, and that detail, small as it was, confirmed everything I already understood. And I stood up, took one last look around the room and walked out without turning on the lights, without making a sound, like I was leaving a place that no longer belonged to me. And the air outside felt different, cooler, sharper, like it carried a sense of clarity I had not felt in a long time. And I placed my suitcase in the back of my car, my hands steady, my movements deliberate. And when I sat in the driver's seat, I paused for just a second, not because I was unsure, but because I was aware that this was the moment everything shifted. And then I started the engine and drove away without looking back. The house disappearing in the rearview mirror. Like something from a past I had already outgrown. And the road ahead stretched out in front of me, quiet and open. And for the first time in years I did not feel trapped, I did not feel small. I felt something else entirely, something unfamiliar but undeniable. Like I had finally stepped into my own life instead of someone else's version of it. And I drove for about 30 minutes before pulling into the parking lot of a small hotel just off the highway. Nothing fancy, just a clean, quiet place where I could think, and as I checked in, the woman at the front desk smiled politely, asking how many nights I would be staying, and I hesitated for a brief moment before answering, I am not sure yet, and even that felt like a kind of freedom I had not allowed myself before. And when I entered the room, I set my suitcase down and sat on the edge of the bed, the silence around me complete, uninterrupted, and I realized that I had not felt this kind of quiet in a very long time, not the kind filled with tension or expectation, but the kind that allowed space for something new, and I leaned back slowly, staring at the ceiling, letting the events of the night settle into something real, something permanent, and just as I closed my eyes, my phone lit up on the bedside table, the screen glowing in the dim light, an unknown number flashing across it, and for a second I considered ignoring it, letting the moment stay as it was, but something about it felt different, something that made me reach for the phone and answer, and a calm, professional voice came through the line, asking if I was Emily Carter, and when I said yes, the next words made my entire body go still in a way I had not expected, because what they said next was not just unexpected, it was something that would change everything I thought I knew about my future. For a moment I did not say anything, I just held the phone against my ear, listening to the quiet hum of the line as if I needed a second to understand that the voice was real, that this was not just another ordinary call, and then I answered, yes, this is Emily, my voice steady, but softer than usual, and the man on the other end introduced himself as Mr. Lawson from a legal firm I had never heard of, his tone calm, professional, the kind that did not rush but carried weight in every word, and he asked me to confirm a few details, my full name, my date of birth, simple things that somehow made the moment feel more serious, more grounded, and once I confirmed them there was a brief pause, just long enough to make my heart beat a little faster, and then he said something that made the room feel completely still, Miss Carter, I am calling regarding the estate of Margaret Hayes, and for a second I frowned slightly, the name unfamiliar at first, distant, like something I had not thought about in years, and then slowly it came back to me, a quiet memory from my childhood, a woman who used to send me birthday cards, who once visited when I was very young, my great-aunt, someone my family had lost contact with over time, someone I had not heard about in so long that I assumed she was simply gone without a trace, and I sat up a little straighter on the bed, my attention fully focused now, and I asked carefully, what about her, and Mr. Lawson continued, his voice unchanged, steady, explaining that she had passed away recently and that I had been named in her will, and I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the phone, not out of fear, not even excitement, but something in between, something uncertain, and I asked the question that felt obvious, what does that mean? And there was another small pause, not awkward, just deliberate, as if he wanted to be clear, as if he understood the weight of what he was about to say, and then he said it plainly, Miss Carter, you are the sole beneficiary of her estate, and for a second I thought I had misheard him, like my mind needed to catch up with the words before accepting them, and I repeated quietly, the sole beneficiary, and he confirmed it, yes, everything has been left to you including liquid assets totaling approximately $1 million, and the number hung in the air between us, heavy, unreal, and I did not respond right away, not because I did not understand, but because I did, completely, and it did not feel the way I imagined something like this would feel. There was no sudden rush of excitement, no overwhelming reaction, just a deep, quiet shift, like something inside me had settled into place without needing to make a sound, and Mr. Lawson continued explaining the next steps, paperwork, verification, meetings that would need to happen in the coming days, but his words started to blur slightly as my thoughts moved elsewhere, not to the money itself, but to what it meant, to the timing of it, to the strange, almost unbelievable way it had arrived at the exact moment I had walked away from everything I thought defined my life, and I realized then that this was not just a coincidence, not in the way it felt, it was something else entirely, something that made the path in front of me suddenly clearer, wider, more open than it had ever been before, and when the call ended, I slowly lowered the phone, staring at the blank screen for a few seconds, letting the silence return to the room, but this time it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something I could not ignore, something that told me that everything that had just happened was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of something I had not even allowed myself to imagine yet. The next morning felt different in a way I could not fully explain, not because everything had suddenly become easy, but because for the first time in a long time, I woke up without that quiet weight pressing on my chest, without the constant feeling that I needed to adjust myself to fit into someone else's expectations. And as I sat up in the hotel bed, the events of the night before came back to me clearly: the call, the words, the number that still did not feel entirely real. And yet there was no doubt about it. Everything had changed, not just around me but inside me, and I reached for my phone, half expecting to see missed calls or messages from Daniel, something dramatic, something demanding. But there was nothing, just silence, and somehow that made everything even clearer, because it meant that I had already stepped out of his world completely, and he had not even noticed. Yet, or maybe he had and simply did not think it mattered, and I stood up slowly, walking to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let the morning light in. And the view was simple: a parking lot, a few cars, a quiet road beyond it, nothing special, but it felt like a clean start, like a blank space waiting for something new. And I took a deep breath, letting it settle in, not rushing, not forcing any decisions, just allowing myself to exist in that moment without pressure. And then I began to move, small steps at first, checking out of the hotel, thanking the woman at the front desk, stepping outside with my suitcase in hand. And as I placed it in the car again, I realized that I was not just leaving a place anymore, I was moving towards something I could finally choose for myself. And over the next few days, everything unfolded in a way that felt almost surreal but also strangely grounded. Meetings with Mr. Lawson, documents, confirmations, signatures, each step making it more real, more tangible, until the number was no longer just something I had heard over the phone. It was something that existed, something that belonged to me. And with that came choices, real choices, not limited by someone else's expectations or control. And I found a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood, nothing extravagant but clean, bright, filled with natural light. A place that felt like it had space for me instead of just space for my responsibilities. And as I stood in that empty living room for the first time, I felt something shift again, not dramatically, just steadily, like I was rebuilding something piece by piece. And I bought simple furniture. Things I actually liked, things that reflected me instead of a version of me that had been shaped by someone else, and each day felt clearer, more focused, like I was learning how to exist without shrinking myself, without waiting for permission. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I realized something important, something I had never fully understood before. The money was not what changed my life. It was the moment I decided to leave, the moment I chose myself without knowing what would come next. And everything that followed was not luck, not coincidence, it was the result of that decision. And as I stood there in my new space, sunlight filling the room, I knew with absolute certainty that I was no longer the same person who had stood outside that door just days before, and I had no intention of ever going back to that version of myself again. It was about 3 weeks later when I finally heard from Daniel, not through a call at first, but through a series of messages that appeared on my phone one after another, his name lighting up the screen in a way that no longer made my chest tighten, only made me pause for a moment before deciding whether I even wanted to read them. And when I did, the tone was exactly what I expected, and yet still strangely distant. "Where are you? Why did you leave like that? We need to talk." Each message carrying a sense of urgency that had never been there when I was still in his life. And I read them slowly, not reacting, not rushing to respond, just observing the shift, the sudden realization that he no longer had control over the situation. And I did not answer right away, not because I was trying to make a point, but because I no longer felt the need to respond on his timeline. And later that day my phone rang. His name again, and this time I answered, not with hesitation, not with fear, just with calm, and for a second there was silence on the other end, like he was not expecting me to actually pick up. And then his voice came through, softer than I remembered, uncertain in a way I had never heard before. "Emily, where are you?" And I let a small pause settle before answering, "I am somewhere else," and he exhaled sharply like he had been holding his breath. "You cannot just leave like that," he said, his tone shifting between frustration and something else he was trying to hide. "We need to fix this," and I listened without interrupting, without reacting, because the words felt familiar, like something from a version of our relationship that no longer existed. And when he mentioned Sophia, saying it was not what it looked like, that it was temporary, that I misunderstood, I realized how far apart we really were, not just physically but in how we saw everything that had happened. And I spoke quietly, not to argue, not to explain, but to state something simple. "Daniel, I did not leave because of one night." And there was a pause on the line, longer this time, heavier, and I continued, "I left because I finally understood my place in your life, and I am not going back to that." And the silence that followed felt different, not empty, but full of something he could not immediately respond to. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was lower, almost unsteady. "What are you talking about? We can work this out. I did not mean those things." And for a moment I closed my eyes, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I recognized the pattern, the way he minimized, the way he adjusted his words now that the situation had changed, and I realized that nothing about this was new, only my response was, and I told him calmly, you already showed me what I meant to you, you just did not expect me to believe it, and that was when his tone shifted completely, the confidence gone, replaced by something closer to regret. Emily, please, he said, and I could almost picture him standing there, trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. And for a brief second I felt a trace of what used to be there, the history, the familiarity, the version of us that once existed, but it did not pull me back, it only reminded me why I had left, and I spoke one last time. Steady and clear, you did not lose me when I walked out that door. You lost me when you stopped seeing me, and I ended the